Romans 7:22. Paul says that he delights in the law of God in his inner being. Not something you hear being taught in churches today. Churches today teach that Paul taught against the law, but we have already established from Acts 21:24-26 that this kind of thinking simply is not true. But then people will quote Romans 6:14, saying that Paul stated we are not under law. True, but keep reading to find out exactly which law Paul is saying we are not under. Romans 8 verse 2, for the law of the Spirit of life has set you free in Christ Jesus from the law of sin and death. The law of God and the law of sin and death are two separate things. The law of sin and death cannot be God's law, which Paul says he delights in, but rather it is the law that arouses our sinful passions, which Paul talks about in Romans 7 verse 5. This is the law that we are freed from, not God's perfect law. But wait, we serve in the way of the Spirit, not in the old way of the written code, right? Correct, but Paul calls the law spiritual in Romans 7 verse 14. He even says in Romans 8 verse 7 that the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God, for it does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. Therefore, those who walk in the Spirit do submit to God's law, even delighting in it, as Paul himself does. Paul encourages us to celebrate this festival of Passover and how we are to celebrate it. In 1 Corinthians 5, verses 7-8, he says, "For Christ our Passover lamb has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." Again in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 20-23, Paul talks about how the Feast of First Fruits points to Christ, that Jesus is the first fruits of those raised from the dead. But what about 2 Corinthians 3, verse 7, where the law is called the ministry of death and the ministry of condemnation? It is true, the law is the ministry of death and condemnation, and that is good. Without the law condemning and killing our flesh, there is no rebirth in Messiah. It is good that it condemns and kills our flesh. If the ministry of death is done away with, we cannot be reborn in Messiah. In 2 Corinthians 13, verse 1, Paul says that every charge must be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. That very command comes from the law of God. Go to Acts 23, 1-5. Paul gets struck, then he insults the high priest, but he apologizes when he finds out he is the high priest and he quotes the law. Paul easily could have said to those people, "This man is no high priest to me. Jesus is my only high priest." But he didn't, which proves that he still has regard and respect for the law. In Galatians 3, verse 17, Paul says that law, which was given later, does not annul the promise to Abraham, because a covenant cannot be annulled or added to once it has been ratified, as it says in Galatians 3, verse 15. Therefore, the new covenant does not annul the law of God. In fact, if you read Jeremiah 31, verses 33-34, the law is included in the new covenant. Where is it? It is to be on our hearts, meaning we desire to keep it. We should delight in the law of God just as Paul and David did, and just as Jesus tells us to keep it. But still, people will go to Colossians 2, verses 20-22, where Paul asks the Colossians why they are submitting to regulations. Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. People automatically think this is talking about the law, but at the end of verse 22, Paul says, according to human precepts and teachings. Therefore, this passage cannot be referring to the law of God. In verse 16, people take it to mean that Paul is saying not to let anyone pass judgment on you for not keeping a festival, a new moon, a Sabbath, or for eating pork, shellfish, or any other thing the law calls unclean. But really, the reality is the exact opposite. Paul is telling the Colossians not to let anyone pass judgment on them for keeping these things. Anyway, that's about all I have for now. Until next time.